we're going to go into a bit more of the women Essenes. Today, our focus is really Anne, who is the little known mother of Mary, the grandmother of Jesus, and what I have discerned is an Essene oracle along the lines of what Tamara and others have been talking about today. So I wanted to, it always takes me a minute to get with my slides here. Oops, alrighty. Yeah, so if you would like more of this information, it's all in my book, The Mystery Tradition of Miraculous Conception, which is about Mary, but it's also very much also about Anne, because what we're going to discover or relearn or be reminded of is that Anne gave birth to Mary in virgin fashion as well. So Mary was not the only one. It was not a one-time event. And we're going to look at some of that other evidence. What I'm looking at here is something called the Infancy Gospel of James, which was originally called the Birth of Mary. And the oldest manuscript of this is the Bodmer Papyrus. So that's what you're seeing right here. And this was unearthed in the sands of Egypt with so many of these texts in the early 20th century, published in 1958. It dates back to the 4th century, but the original text was probably written much earlier, probably much closer to the time of Jesus, by this individual named James, who probably was one of Joseph's sons by another woman. And so when the Catholic Church was deciding which Gospels get into the official canon, which don't, they threw this one on the rubbish heap in the Gelasian decree. But luckily for us, it is still here with us. And so we're going to see what this says. So when we start with this gospel, we are introduced to Anne, and of course, her name then was Hannah, and her husband, Joachim, and they are part of a revered holy couple, very high level in the Hebrew community. Now, most likely, this was the Essene community, but it seems that, you know, they also had connections into the official Jewish temple. So it's not really clear here. There's not quite enough information. And we hear about them in the Quran. You know, we actually hear more about these people in the Quran than we do in the canonical Bible. She is not named. She's, of course, in that patriarchal way, referred to as the wife of Joachim, who's known as Imran or Imram in the Quran. And she is considered a mystic, particularly favored by God. So these people are special. They are these Essenes who go by these elevated principles, live this exalted life. And we find out that there's something else they want to do, which is to give birth to these special star beings, these divine beings. But in Anne's case, she has been childless. So we find out that she's at a low point in her life. When we read about her in this gospel, she's mourning because she is childless, and also because Joachim has been upset about this as well, and he's chosen to go on a fast in the desert to pray about this situation. Now, we're going to find out, again, this is about no mere conception. These are not ordinary people just wanting an ordinary child. This child is the special child that she has been trained and ordained to bring in, and it hasn't been happening, and they are upset. This needs to happen. So Anne goes into this ritual, and this is where we start seeing some of these details, and I'm able to bring to life some of this because of all the research into virgin birth, virgin conception that I did regarding ancient Greece. So when I looked at this birth of Mary gospel, this infancy gospel of James, I was able to see all of these codes being revealed. And one of the first things we see here is that Anne decides to change her attitude. She decides to remove her clothes of mourning, and she washes her face. And then she does something rather surprising for somebody who is upset about having a child. She puts on a wedding dress. So what are we seeing here? This gospel is revealing a series of ritual actions in which she is preparing for a sacred marriage ceremony. And we're going to find out exactly what that means as we go along. To start with, the wedding dress is the very same type of ritual garment worn by the Sumerian, the ancient Iraqi priestesses. They would once a year at least, or something of that nature, the very high priestess would embody the goddess Inanna in a sacred marriage rite. And this was during the celebration of the new year, possibly also on other occasions. And we know that washing was part of this ritual bath in ancient Sumer. However, in the case of the high priestess of Inanna, it was not her face that was washed, it was her vulva. So it's likely that the term face in Anne's case is a delicately veiled reference to her vulva, either by the author of the gospel, or perhaps it was a word substituted by a later horrified scribe, because we have this scribal tampering in these documents as well. And so, since we know that there is no male partner with Anne now, okay, because Joachim is in the wilderness on his vision quest, what would this marriage be? Well, this marriage, this wedding she would be enacting is an inner one, a sacred marriage with herself. And I believe that she's entering into the required inner tantric state for a divine procreative act. And if you want more on my discussion on this, go into the mystery tradition of miraculous conception. I talk about what this state is and other pieces of evidence that prophetic women were engaged in this kind of thing. Now, what I have shown in my work is that the earliest kind of divine conception practice of this elevated avatar being, this was the whole purpose, was to bring in these high beings. The earliest kind was what we know of as parthenogenesis, okay? Self-conception. And what I have come to find out is that, of course, pure parthenogenesis, because the woman's eggs are all XX, it results in a female, all right? It was only in a later stage that the women were able to bring in males through parthenogenesis, which is what Mary did. But Anne is now in the oldest practice, which is she's giving birth to herself as Mary. And so I think that Anne's situation is one of the oldest forms of holy parthenogenesis. And what the gospel tells us is that as she is washing herself, putting on her wedding dress, she then goes to her garden to take a walk. Another code. The garden has always been understood as a domain of women's magic. And this garden metaphor can be traced back to the Garden of the Gods of the Sumerians, the Garden of Eden of the Hebrews, and of course, our favorite, Lemuria, realms where humans were thought to be easily in contact with the divine. Now, we also learn that Anne goes to perch at a particular place in her garden, which is the laurel tree. Another code, because in the ancient world at the time when she would have lived, the laurel was famously the original centerpiece of the great pilgrimage site of the Greek oracle of Delphi, where the women served as prophetesses. And as I've shown in my research, there's plentiful evidence that the priestesses of Delphi were not only oracles, they were also holy women initiated into the practice of divine birth. And here we see the situation where the high priestess of Delphi, who came to be known as Daphne, whose name means laurel, was pursued in unwanted sexual fashion by the god Apollo. And she escaped this rape, essentially, by asking for divine help, and she was turned into the tree. So there are many, mysteries associated with it. And this also shows us how these male beings were starting to get in on the act of these women who were going for divine parthenogenesis, but they would come in kind of like sharks, to blood, and sniff these situations out, and they would want to impregnate the women with their issue so that these, Anunnaki type hybrids could come in. All right. But in Anne's case, she is remaining in the safe zone. And we know that the laurel is also significant because in the ancient world, chewing these laurel leaves was a known means of expanding one's consciousness. It was the DMT, of the day, the ketamine, the mushrooms of the day. And it wasn't just that, there were other medicines that women were using to achieve what I've determined is the trance state necessary not only for delivering prophecy, but also for conceiving children through divine means. And so what we further see in this story is that Anne rests at this laurel tree. And what is that? I came to understand that these references to sleep and drowsiness are signs that a priestess has entered into a trance induced by these powerful medicines for just such purposes. So Anne's resting by the laurel tree is a veiled clue that she is entering an altered state of consciousness, probably through chewing the leaves of the laurel. And this is placing her very clearly in the lineage of divine birth prophetesses. What does she do then? Well, very interestingly, she asks the divine realms for the same blessing that was bestowed on the elder Sarah. Remember Sarah from the Bible, the wife of Abraham? Anne is asking for the same blessing that was bestowed on Sarah when she did what? Divinely conceived Isaac. And so in doing so, what we're seeing is Anne is verifying that she's part of a special lineage of sacred Hebrew women, maybe sacred Essene women. And I will go further to say that Anne is acknowledging the fact that Sarah's birth of Isaac was similarly not a miracle of happenstance just because she was praying real hard and she was, a good woman, but rather something she had groomed herself to intentionally accomplish. She had trained herself in this. So with this prayer, Anne is calling on the divine powers to assist her with a special conception that she will soon accomplish. Now, I want to step into Sarah a bit, because this is always sort of glossed over, even in the Christian tradition. Oh, Sarah, she conceived when she was an older woman, and isn't that nice how generous God was with her? Well, let's take a look, okay? Essentially, she's the first woman that we hear about who had a miraculous conception in the Hebrew tradition. And there's a book called Sarah the Priestess by Savina Tuval. And Savina digs deeply into ancient Middle Eastern art, tablets, legal codes, and legends. And she makes the very convincing case that this biblical wife of Abraham was nothing less than a female spiritual leader. And she argues that Sarah's roles are remarkably similar to those of several types of priestesses in this area of the world, roughly around the time that Sarah would have lived. And these were the Lukur priestess, the En priestess, and the Naditu priestess. And so what Tuval uncovers is that Sarah carried out aspects of all three of these roles at different points in her life. And these roles involved chastity and sacred marriage rites, both of which, as I talk about extensively, were aspects of the divine birth practice. Now, what's key here is that by the time Sarah is on the scene with divine birth, the Naditu priestess had to remain childless, which is very odd. So there's been like a kind of a disruption of the conception aspect of this, such that if pregnancy occurred, the child would meet a terrible fate. It would be left outdoors in some remote place, exposed to the elements that usually meant death. So how I read this is that this represented a growing societal control over women, over these high priestesses, and the degeneration of a practice that was originally designed to bring out these avatars. Now, in certain like certain of these Naditu priestesses, Sarah was allowed to marry, but she did not have children, which is also in alignment with the laws regarding both the En and the Naditu priestess. And what Tuval brings forth is that when Sarah makes that famous biblical statement in Genesis 16:2, the Lord has kept me from having children. Tuval rightly points out that this is not Sarah complaining about just her biological barrenness, but this is a reference to the religious laws that she had to follow that forbade her from procreating. And Tuval, what we're seeing here is this attempted sacrifice of Isaac by Abraham. You start connecting the dots. Tuval suggests that Abraham's attempt to sacrifice Isaac, who was eventually divinely born of Sarah, because she was, a little bit of a rebel here, that this was an effort to obey this law and follow through with this horrific custom of killing any child that was conceived through a sacred marriage ritual. Okay, so in other words, Sarah, Anne's predecessor, was a high priestess with a desire for a child whose womb was restricted and controlled. Now, it seems that Sarah was a specialized priestess who was prophetic. She was a prophetess, and she was meant for celibacy, other than, except for when she was involved in sacred marriage rituals. So this is very curious. Celibacy, they had to remain celibate, except for these special high priestess times where they would engage in these sacred marriage rituals, presumably with a male actor. And this was high-level sex magic, religious magic. And so we're going to see that basically Sarah was engaging several times in a kind of a sex rite, whether it was with another man or with just by herself, but that something was going on more deeply, and she wanted this child. And so if we accept that Sarah was a Naditu an En, a Lukur priestess, that is a divine birth priestess, then celibacy requirement, it may well be that she was never the formal wife of Abraham in the conjugal sense, okay? And even Tuval says the union of Sarah and Abraham was probably not looked upon as a marriage in which sexual intercourse played a part. So what does that mean? He was her guardian, her friend, and, her protector. And we're going to see a bit more of this with Anne, because this whole hidden lineage of these Hebrew or Essene women, that's only now coming to light. And it's very important for us that we tease this out and understand these hidden secrets, because they are showing us the way forward as well as backward. So we're looking here at the Code of Hammurabi, one of the earliest legal codes formulated by this Babylonian king Hammurabi, who lived around 1792 BCE. And there is a law in here that strikingly fits Sarah's situation. According to these laws, a married Naditu had permission to offer her servant to her husband in order to produce sons. So the Naditu was married. She couldn't really procreate with this man, but she could give her servant to her husband in order for him to continue on his lineage. Well, doesn't it get interesting now, especially also in light of, current events that are going on in this part of the world? The code said that if the servant became a little uppity because she was going to have this man's child, her master's husband's child, if she became prideful and uppity, the Naditu priestess could demote her to the level of slave, okay? And that is, she could treat her any way she wanted and badly. What do we see in Genesis 16? This exact situation is enacted when Sarah hands off the bearing of Abraham's children to her Egyptian slave, Hagar. And after Hagar gives birth to Abraham's son, Ishmael, she does flaunt her newfound status in Sarah's face, and Sarah gets angry. She treats her harshly. That's probably, and she banishes her and her son Ishmael. And this is this whole horrible story. They're in the desert. They find a spring miraculously. And Ishmael, in turn, becomes the founding father of the rival faith to Judaism, the Islamic religion. And although this Code of Hammurabi is dated around 1754 BCE, which is most likely later than the time when Sarah lived, it points to what might have been a long-time custom by which these Naditu priestesses could get around controls on their reproduction. And I further contend that some of these priestesses continued to practice divine conception rituals with the idea of having children, despite these laws. And that this is exactly what Sarah did. And so Tuval says that Sarah might have engaged in these sacred marriage rites 3 times in her life. One was with an Egyptian pharaoh. That's written about in the Bible, Genesis 12. Another was when the 3 messengers prophesied of her coming pregnancy in Genesis 18. And a third was with the polytheistic king Abimelech of Gerar in Genesis 20. Now, in terms of conceiving Isaac, all that Genesis 21:1 tells us about this divine impregnation is that, quote, the Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did unto Sarah as he had spoken. So it may be that the sacred marriage rite she carried out took place exclusively with God alone, or as we will soon see, is most likely the case with Anne and later with Mary. It did occur through Parthenogenesis, the old priestess way. Now, it's important to note that there is a fragrance in some of the descriptions of sacred marriage rites or divine conception rituals that the males may have been involved, but spiritually or energetically rather than physically. And we just saw in the previous presentation, the idea being channeled, Jesus said that these were conceptions of light. Claire Hartsong also channels that and says that the kind of divine pregnancies that Mary's lineage, her mother Anne, Sarah before her, was capable of were light conceptions. These were through the use of, high voltage quantum light into the egg, right? And what Claire discovered is that these conceptions were assisted by a male consort's energy essence merging with the priestesses, but not their seed. And so this may be why the males in the conceptions of Sarah and Anne and Mary are ambiguously involved. Okay, they don't seem to be anywhere near the premises, but they're still kind of called the father of these children, but they're not really. So they were involved in some kind of support work of these women. And then we see that by the Hellenistic Jewish philosopher who lived in Alexandria, Egypt, approximately 20 BCE to 50 of the Common Era, he states that Sarah and these other matriarchs and all of their doings were secret teachings that were not to be shared with the uninitiated. And he claimed that divine conceptions took place not only for Sarah, but also for the other matriarchs, Zipporah, the wife of Moses, Rebecca, the wife of Isaac, and Leah, the wife of Jacob. And in another work, he adds Tamar to the list. So he, believe it or not, he proposes that virginity was key to the foundation of Judaism itself, okay? Not just Catholicism, but going back a ways, virginity. And so he emphasizes the discussion, talking about these four matriarchs, that virginity was critical to them divinely conceiving the children who would be the key leaders of the Israelites. And so, there's a lot of hullabaloo, like, okay, were there virgins in the Hebrew temples? We'll get to that in a minute. But Philo writes that Sarah had to engage in inner purifications to return herself to what he refers to as the class of pure virgins in order to have this successful sacred union with God to conceive a child. So this class of pure virgins thing is something we're going to see a little bit later with Anne and Mary. And so it seems that virginity was also something that could be periodically restored, which is something we see with the ancient goddesses like Hera. There are stories of this in India up into modern day times, that there can be a purification. They're celibate, but if they are engaging in sex rites, they need to return to virginity again for their next ritual, right? So these are deep, deep mysteries. Philo is saying, should we even be looking? Well, of course, we need to. All right. So again, Abraham is still credited with the social fatherhood of Isaac due to his sort of guardianship with Sarah. And so again, we're going to see this with Anne and Mary, where Joachim, the partner of Anne, and Joseph, the partner of Mary, are considered the social fathers of these women's divinely born children, even though they are not their biological fathers. So back to Anne now. I believe that Anne is upset about not having a child because this is not the first ritual she has done to try to have a divine conception. time is marching on, and she really wants to happen, but she is really, putting it on now. She's really coming into it. And we don't know what her schooling was like for this, but we're going to see hints of it. Well, we do see hints of it later in the Birth of Mary Gospel, and I write about that extensively in the mystery tradition of miraculous conception. It is fascinating. Won't have time to go into it today. But what we're told is that Anne gives her daughter Mary over to the temple for years of instruction by these virgins, all right? So we're going to see more of that. Now, here we have, meanwhile, while Anne is engaging in this ritual of divine conception, Joachim is in the desert praying. So he is still, again, this is how he's participating, right? He's going, who knows what kind of sacred medicines he's taking out there. And he's praying. This is extended periods, extended days, probably fasting and so forth. And eventually the angel comes. Well, we'll get to that in a minute, but before that happens, all right, Anne in her garden, in this altered state, doing this ritual, is having a low moment. She sees a nest of fertile sparrows in the laurel tree, and she now begins to lament that she's lower even than the animals who can freely reproduce all around her in the regular way. So what I feel is that this is her dark night of the soul moment, kind of like, Jesus on the cross. That's like a moment of a little bit of weakness, but it's like a total and utter humbling moment. And it may be this that allows this conception to finally happen, where she's like down on her knees. I'm nobody, who are you? And she, this is when it's going to happen. Now, I want to just go a little bit back into the Hebrew Bible again with the story of her biblical namesake, Hannah, okay? The wife of this man named Elkanah. She was similarly in distress over her childlessness, and she went to the temple to pray for a son. Now, what we hear there is that the priest of the temple, Eli, thought she was drunk in the temple because of her dramatic weeping. Here again, we see this little code. I would say that her drunkenness was actually a sign of her altered state of consciousness, perhaps, again, brought about by plant medicine. And what do we learn about this Hannah? She was no ordinary woman. She was a prophetess. Again, a role that many of these divine birth priestesses held. And sure enough, after praying for a son in the temple in her altered state, and after vowing to offer any son that is born to her back to God in service to the temple, she did conceive a child, Samuel. All right. There is an implication here that this is a divine conception. So Anne is not the first Hannah, to be in this kind of situation. Now, eventually, Anne is able to pull through in this ritual. A divine messenger, one of these angelics that has been talked about today, suddenly appears before her, telling her that her prayers have been answered, that she will give birth, and that her child will be talked about all over the world. So Anne has gone through that ego death, and she succeeds in activating a divine child in her womb. And we hear no further details about this process, but there are, again, potential clues later in the gospel when we hear about Mother Mary's conception of Jesus. Now, like Hannah in the Hebrew Bible that we just heard about, Anne vows to offer the child to the divine as a gift to the temple. So this divine conception is, we're not just going to have the kid running around. they're going to be in a sacred container, a sacred environment at a certain point. But Anne does not specify that the child needs to be male. She makes a point of saying that her vow holds whether the child is male or female. And so what we hear is that then, again, Joachim is informed by this angelic presence, and he's delighted, and he gives instructions for, a ritual feast, a public celebratory feast that's going to happen. And we hear here that Anne waits for him while standing at the gate. And as soon as she spots him, she rushes to him and passionately throws her arms around his neck, which, the thing is, we already know that Anne is pregnant. She's become pregnant while Joachim is away. He had nothing physically to do with this pregnancy, right? But with this scene of the gate, the priest and priestess, and the feast, we're in this fascinating territory of the Sumerian sacred marriage rite. Here we're seeing a vase dating from the end of the fourth millennium, BCE, which is believed to convey a scene in which the sacred bridegroom, bearing these abundant gifts of food, meets the high priestess for a ritual at a gate that she opens to him. And in related images, these gate posts are identified as the symbol of the goddess Inanna, who again is the very deity represented in the sacred marriage ceremony described in ancient Sumerian poetry. And as part of the rite, as we've learned, the priestess who embodies Inanna greets her consort with a ceremonial embrace. So it may be that, a number of threads of types of rituals are coming together, but Anne and Joachim are doing this in the highest level possible, where the priestess must become the divine androgyne, the male female, to conceive in and of herself. And I talk about that in my book quite a bit. So Anne gives birth to Mary. And it's a touching scene in this gospel where she asks, is it a boy or a girl, to the midwife? And the midwife says it's a girl. And Anne says, I have been greatly honored this day. So, this is one of these matriarchal moments in the gospel, showing Anne in contrast to her Hebrew divine birth forebears, who were legitimated only by the birth of sons. And after the prescribed days of post-birth purification according to Jewish law, Anne breastfeeds Mary and gives her the name Mary. And as I discuss extensively in the Hebrew, it's Miriam, the New Testament Mariam, the Greek Maria, the English Mary, but this probably derives from the Egyptian term Mary, which meant beloved, desired lover, the one who is loved, who loves, and who is love, all at the same time. And I talk about how that Mary name is a priestess title, connoting that, which is why we have so many Marys in the Bible, including the Magdalene. And so what we see is that Mary walks early. She walks at 6 months old. She's an advanced child. And at that point, Anne takes her into the sanctuary of her room, and she does not let Mary's feet touch the earth again. There's always a covering. And this is a little bit like the Kumari in Nepal, who is brought into a very sacred kind of situation. Her feet never touch the ground, and she's supposed to be the incarnation of the goddess. And what Anne does is she turns her entire bedroom into a sanctuary to raise her. Nothing profane or unclean enters the space. This may also refer to a purified diet. that Anne puts Mary on. And these first few years, Mary spends in seclusion with her mother so that she, can grow up in a very calm, a very loving, a very advanced way. And again, our friend, the Jewish philosopher Philo, describes these inner shrines of the therapeutai, who are a branch of the Essenes. And he says, in every house, there's a sacred shrine, which is called the holy place. And the house in which the therapeutai retire by themselves and perform all the mysteries of a holy life, bringing in nothing, neither meat nor drink nor anything else, which is indispensable toward supplying the necessities of the body, but studying in that place the laws and the sacred oracles of God enunciated by the holy prophets, and hymns and psalms and all kinds of other things. So this is an Essene practice that Anne is engaging in. And we next hear that Anne does something else very intriguing. She brings the undefiled daughters of the Hebrews to visit with Mary in this sequestered room. These are basically the virgins of the temple. All right. Yes, there were virgins. It's all over the Hebrew Bible. And they were weavers. Several mentions of them in Kings and so forth. They were weaving the veil of the Holy of Holies, and they were virgins. They were celibates. And we know that religiously oriented virgins were alive and well all throughout the ancient Middle East, Egypt, the Greco-Roman worlds, and so forth. And so it seems to me that these priestesses were teaching the Virgin Mary. The text says that they were washing her, they were purifying her, and they might have been teaching her those songs that were talked about earlier, because we find out later that one of Mary's gifts is this gift of song. So I'm going to just move through this quickly here so that we can conclude on time. Eventually, Anne and Joachim give Mary to the temple when she is 3 years old. And the amazing thing is that Mary never looks back at her parents. The priestesses surround her with lit lanterns. It's dark, but she never looks back. And she's presented at the temple, and she's 3 years old, and she starts dancing on the steps in front of the high priest. So she's been trained by these priestesses in the songs, in the dances. All right. And so I think I will conclude there. There's much more to the story, which includes that that Elizabeth divinely conceives John the Baptist at what looks to be the very same ritual in which Mary conceives Jesus. It's posited as a weaving ritual. And according to the Islamic tradition, Elizabeth is actually the sister of Anne. So what we see is this network of women and their divine conception practices that are passed on generation to generation, that this was intimately involved in Essene life.